Hi, I'm Elena and I run Little Lunar Co., which is a small business where I make handmade Asian scented candles and soaps. In this video, I'll be talking about my new version of my Thai iced tea candle that looks like actual Thai iced tea. I also updated the label so it's more cohesive with my actual branding, and I think it looks cuter than the original label, even though those were pretty nice as well. I will be going over the whole process in this video from start to finish, making this full-size candle and also a mini version of it as well. I thought it would be cool to show the step-by-step process of me testing and also making the first batch of my products in real time, showing my realistic mistakes and spills and everything that goes into the process. First, I tested the color. On the left is my first attempt, which was lighter than I was aiming for. So on the second time around on the right, I added much more dye and it turned out exactly like how I envisioned it, with the high contrast between the white wax on the bottom and the deep orange color on the top. The second testing I did was to see if the wick and the container size was compatible. So I wanted to see if it burned cleanly down without tunneling. On the top left was the first attempt I had, which had some tunneling, as you can see, where there isn't wax that is being melted on the sides of the container. Below on the bottom left, it did a lot better when I burned it for longer, and my boyfriend did a power burn on the right one and it burned all the way to the bottom. So that meant that the jar, wax, and wick were compatible with each other for this candle, so I can go ahead and make the actual candles. I prepped the candle vessels by spraying rubbing alcohol on each of them and then wiping them with a paper towel to remove any debris and residue on the inside of the vessel. This helps the wick sticker stick on the bottom of the container better and also helps the wax adhere to the sides, so it minimizes any chance of shrinkage and wet spots with the wax. Wet spots are when the wax separates from the container and not aesthetically pleasing, so I'm trying to minimize this as much as possible for my clear candle container. I'm removing the paper from the wax sticker so I can adhere it to the bottom of the jar. I already attached the wick clip to the wick, and I'm using a wooden wick here to add a crackle effect to my candles. In the future, I might invest in a centering device that ensures the wick is as centered as possible in the container. But right now, I'm just eyeballing it, and I am usually pretty good at seeing the center of the vessel. However, when I make it at scale and want to grow to sell wholesale, I want to make it as perfect as possible. These wicks are pretty strong compared to the size of the container, so it has a little bit of leeway when it comes to the wax on the side of the container and should avoid tunneling even if it's slightly off center. But if it is a weak wick and not able to account for that, then it would create tunneling, since not all the wax would be melted if it's slightly off center, and one side of the container would be melted while the other is not. I usually use this big pitcher when I measure my wax because it can usually hold all the wax that I need, and it also perfectly fits on top of my scale that I'm using here. Depending on the size of the container and how many candles I'm making, I calculate exactly how much wax I need. When I was making the candles, I increased the amount of dye incrementally from the left to the right, testing as I go until I got the color I wanted. I need to test the color by putting a drop of the candle wax with the dye onto the parchment paper to see what the actual color would be like, because when it cools, it is a completely different color than when it is hot, like how it is here. It turns a much paler color, so it's hard to see what the color will actually turn out like from this color when it is heated up. However, after watching other candle making videos, I saw another person do that, which was a really great tip to achieve the color that I want and not waste any wax in the meantime. These are the kind of tips and tricks that I look for to minimize costs as a small business and try to be as efficient as possible. I wanted to be real and transparent as possible, showing that I do spill and make mistakes during these videos and see what it's actually like realistically to be a candle maker. So I'm showing that here. I'm using a chopstick, which is a tip from other candle makers to reduce the amount of dripping on the side of the container. I was still trying to get the hang of this, and there's definitely still dripping here, but it would be a lot less than if I had done it without the chopstick. I've now invested in a tool that prevents this altogether, which is a pancake batter dispenser, which I've seen a lot of girls use when they make their candles. It sounds kind of weird, but it was actually pretty genius, whoever first thought about it, and it is a game changer for candle makers. I am also using two other chopsticks tied together with some rubber bands as a makeshift device to hold the wicks in place, but I also eventually just invested in actual wick holders. I swirl the wax in the containers to add more wax up the walls and add more of a gradient effect between the lower layer and the upper layer of the candle. When the wax is slightly cooled, I add the second layer of wax, which is the white color, to add that contrast in the candle and make it look like a real mixed drink that we see when people pour milk into the Thai iced tea. I've learned that timing is everything with this method, and also the temperature of the wax is also really important. So the wax needs to be cooled enough, but it still needs to be a little malleable in order to still create a gradient effect in mixing it up between the two layers, so it's not just a strict band between the lower and upper layer. Right now it looks like a straight line between the two layers, and it looks like jello layers basically, which I do not want. So after this, I use my chopstick to mix and agitate the plates in between to create a more gradient effect between the lower layer and the upper layer. This takes more time and effort, but I find that it does create a very realistic effect when it's blended together like this. Like I mentioned before, the bottom layer needs to be cooled and solid enough that it doesn't melt when the upper layer of wax comes into contact with it. And also the upper layer can't be too hot, or else it would just melt the bottom layer entirely and it'll just all blend together and be one color instead of maintaining two different layers. So it really becomes more like an art form here, and it takes a lot of patience and timing for this to work out. The wick holder is especially important here because, as you can see, after hot wax is melted onto it, it starts drooping. So it becomes really important to have a holder in place that keeps the wick straight. When I'm making two types of candles at once, of course, the smaller candle cools a lot faster than the larger candle. So I'm doing this one second, and there's a much longer wait time between pouring the two layers. And here you can see that the bottom layer is still pretty melted compared to the smaller containers. And so this led to more of a transitional gradient effect between the bottom and the upper layer, looking more like a sunset. So if that's the kind of look that you want to go for, then you should aim for the bottom layer to look like this. I personally wanted two distinct layers, but still have some blending in between the two layers. So I prefer it to be cooler than this. So I kept that in mind for the future candles I poured. I went ahead and blended the two layers together like I did for the small candles. So I'll speed up this part here since it's essentially the same step. When the top layer is mostly cooled, I add in what I think is the cutest step, which is adding these little ice cubes on top, especially for these mini little Thai iced tea cups. I made the ice cubes by cutting gel wax to a square shape that's a little bit smaller than half of the diameter of the cup, so it can fit nicely into the cup. I wanted it to be still a little melted in the layer so the ice cubes can sink in like it does in a real cup. But sometimes you don't catch it at the exact right time. So when that's the case, I use a heat gun to melt the top layer, and then I add the ice cubes laid on top. I think these candles help me a little bit get over my perfectionism because when it looks more imperfect, it looks more realistic. So I've been really embracing being imperfect and making mistakes, and that's okay as a small business owner. Knowing me, if I waited until everything was perfect, I wouldn't be selling anything at all for years. And the important part as a small business owner is to just get started. So I'm glad that I'm really pushing myself to get over my perfectionist tendencies. The last step for these smaller candles is to trim the wick, and then I'm done. If the tops are still a little uneven, then I just run a heat gun over it one last time. I go ahead and do the same thing for the larger candle, trimming the wood wick with the specialized wick trimmer, and I trim it before adding the ice cubes because sometimes when the ice cubes are there, it gets in the way of the wick trimmer. So it's much easier to do it beforehand for wooden wicks. For the gel wax, I cut them larger than I did for the smaller container, so it looks proportional for this cup. I got a silicone mold for square pieces to use as the ice cubes, but I'm still deciding if I want to keep it because they're a little bit larger than what I wanted. So I'm still trying to find a way to make that work and keep it. I'm really happy with how these turned out. They look really realistic to me and it's blended between the two layers. For the one on the right, it is more of the transitional gradient and more sunset like, and that is what I was referring to earlier. On the left, it is more separate for the two different layers, but still blended. So that was the exact effect I was aiming for these types of candles. So I'm really happy about the way that this one turned out. Again, going back to the perfectionism, both of these candles perform the exact same way. It just has a slightly different aesthetic. So it's not going to hold me back from selling the one on the right because some people could prefer that too. And it's just a natural part of handmade products that each one is different from one another. I'm really happy with how both sizes came out, especially since this was my first real attempt at making a batch of these candles. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, you would also like my next video making Vietnamese iced coffee candles.